I went to January 6th in a different way than any other person did. So I wanted to see these people, because the right in this country tell me all the time that they really care about freedom of expression. So I went there in a Biden hoodie. Joe Biden all over it. And the whole day I was like, yeah, I love Joe Biden. In fact, I want Hunter Biden to be his running mate. I wanted to see the type of reaction I would get from people.
I'm really glad you didn't get murdered that day.
I did not. The thing is, I went there not knowing it was going to be that bad.
Hey everybody, my name's Jess, and I'm really excited to introduce Ford Fischer and Dylan Burns. These guys have some really incredible stories to share. We've got 30 minutes, so we're going to try to just get into it. But can we get some quick intros, starting with you, Ford?
Yeah, so my name is Ford Fischer. I am a primary source video journalist, and what I mean by that is I film political activism and I release live streams and raw video while basically completely omitting myself or commentary on the subjects that I cover.
Cool. And Dylan?
My name is Dylan Burns. I've done a lot of work for the Democratic Party in the state of Maryland, but I'm most well known for being a Twitch streamer, and recently I just got back from Ukraine where I was a frontline journalist.
I'm going to tell a quick little story. We're talking about extremism and political violence today, but one of my colleagues told me this story. He had a dad pass away last year, and his family had to have 2 funerals for his dad, the Californians and the Arizonans, because they needed a politically divided funeral, the Democrats and the Republicans. And when I heard this, I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. This is too much for me. So that a level of extremism was, for me, that was like, when we're dividing family funerals, I'm not contributing it to it anymore. So we've got some really cool stories to bring out about extremism, but extremism can start in the home. That's where divisions really started between parents, siblings. And I just kind of want to hear a little bit about your guys' thoughts on the extremism that you see it out in the streets, you see it, you see that violence, but where do you think it's coming from? What is feeding people's division that gets it to the point where we have these kind of protests that are out there that you're getting tear gassed in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the types of situations that lead to the division that you're sort of describing come from not just a divergence of what sort of should be done, but the reality that fundamentally exists. So the violence at sort of the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021 was not just over who should be the president upcoming, right? It wasn't just a Donald Trump should be the president versus Joe Biden should be the president, or simply Trump should not be the president. It was about fundamentally certain people didn't believe that the election happened the way that it was reported, whereas others did. And that is a conflict of realities, not simply a conflict of sort of desired reality for the future. And I think that that particular divergence leads to a possibility both of extreme views, of a really hostile situation of behavior toward one another when you believe that someone else, not just we have a difference of opinion, but this person believes the lies, right? Or something like that. It's a much more dramatic split. And I would say, by the way, that hasn't changed that much. Even in the time since all of that violence occurred, 70% of Republicans today believe that the election of 2020 was stolen. So the sort of tension that led to violence at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021, that division of reality hasn't actually stopped. It is just sort of on pause as far as the types of events that the media is really desiring to cover.
I think social media plays a much bigger role than a lot of us realize. Social media is designed specifically to make us angry, because the angrier we are, the more we're going to use social media. The Facebook whistleblower exposed this when she came out publicly, that the Facebook algorithm motivates people to have angry responses, angry reactions, because you're more likely to comment and give a long back and forth argument on a social media post if it's an angry post about somebody throwing racial slurs or somebody punching somebody else or somebody doing something that's really divisive, instead of like, hey, I had this story about a Republican and a Democrat getting together, hugging it out, or I just had this lovely cat video. If you look at all the top posts on social media, on places like Facebook and Twitter, it's going to be extremely divisive posts. It's not going to be good news about us coming together or anything like that. And the algorithm is built that way. But then what he was talking about when it comes to a separate reality, that is true. The social media will specifically design a profile of what it will show you depending on what you want to see or what to like. For example, I like a post about, let's say, I'm a libertarian. I like a post about some lowering of taxes. The social media is going to look at that, and then they're going to recommend me other posts they think I might like about libertarianism. And it's going to give me a bubble that makes me think, it seems like everyone's a libertarian. Every post I see on social media is about how everyone wants to lower taxes, how the Fed needs to be abolished, and how the military-industrial complex is destroying the world. But if you go outside that bubble and you go to a protest where you're going to talk to people who might disagree with you, Republicans, Democrats, other types of people, you're going to have that bubble popped. Because you're going to think, well, social media told me, because what I saw is that you're the person who wants to go to Afghanistan and kill all the babies. Or you're the person who wants to abort all the babies, kill them all. Or you're the person who wants to take women's bodily autonomy away. And because of that perspective of how you see other people framed in social media, because that's how they want you to react to these posts in an angry way so they can have you on social media longer, you're going to have a skewed version of the world after living in an online bubble. And so I am a huge advocate for telling people to make multiple social media accounts and test this out. Like certain posts on one account, like certain posts on another account, and see what type of information flows to you from these different accounts. And you can see how quickly social media will skew your view of the world.
I would just very quickly add on that part of the kind of solution that big tech has come up with to some of the more extreme wings that show up on these social media sites is to censor them off of the platform, such as Facebook or YouTube saying that you can't describe what they believe is election disinformation. And the result of that has tended to be the migration of users onto other platforms, such as, President Trump made a social media website, but I mean, there's others like it, Gab. There used to be Parler until that just turned out to give everything to the feds and then disappear. Truth Social, which is Trump's thing. But so there's this migration into not just echo chambers within Facebook, but now you have an entire social media alternative that's literally just people who already agree with you, which is going to entrench you deeper into those opinions that you already had.
And I just one last thing before I assume you have to move on. We only have 30 minutes. Notice how they will ban accounts I'm a lefty Democrat. I do believe there is a limit to, of course, advocating for violence, things like that. But they want to, get a sledgehammer and ban accounts instead of changing the algorithm. That is the real systematic issue. The systematic issue they don't want to address because that would cut into the profit margin.
So both Ford and Dylan were on the ground on January 6th, and I think we should definitely dive into it because we're here to talk about political violence and extremism, and it was so well documented and covered, documented by independent journalists like Ford. So I want to hear, what was your experience on the ground January 6th? What did you see? Your thoughts? Let's start with Dylan.
So I went to January 6th in a different way than any other person did. So I wanted to see these people, because the right in this country tell me all the time that they really care about freedom of expression. So I went there in a Biden hoodie. Joe Biden all over it. And the whole day I was like, yeah, I love Joe Biden. In fact, I want Hunter Biden to be his running mate. I wanted to see the type of reaction I would get from people.
I'm really glad you didn't get murdered that day.
I did not. The thing is, I went there not knowing it was going to be that bad. I thought it would be like some other protests I had been to. I had been given warnings from from organizers in the community, because I'm from Maryland, so I know many people in D.C. My mother was a homeless resident in D.C., and they told me, we're not going to go. We're not doing any counter-protests. All the usual Antifers, they're not going, right? And so I partially went there because I wanted to test that out, but also, this is my community. This is where I grew up in. This is where I went to the food trucks in. My grandfather worked in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. I think D.C. is a little bit in my veins. And so I felt when I saw everybody else back down from going, like a little bit like, well, this is my community. Nobody can tell me I can't walk in my own town with whatever I'm going to wear. It turned me into a mini libertarian for a second. And so I go there in this Joe Biden hoodie. And as the day wore on, the type of dialogue that was directed towards me got worse and worse and worse. Thankfully, no one ever got violent towards me. The worst thing that happened towards me was a few slurs and people spitting in my direction. But there was certain points where I was talking to people, and yes, I did see violence, and I will describe one instance of violence that I think I was the only one to capture on film. But there was an interaction I had with somebody where I was wearing this Biden hoodie. He comes up to me and he says, why are you wearing that? I was like, well, I voted for Joe Biden. He's like, why are you a traitor? I was like, a traitor? In his mind, whatever he saw about Joe Biden to make the idea that voting for the other candidate makes you commit the act of treason, which can get you the death penalty in this country, by the way. And I had multiple people say that you should be accused of treason, and that what comes with that is the death penalty, basically saying I should be executed for just wearing this hoodie. There's no way for me to even know what he saw online to make you think that's a reasonable way to talk with somebody you disagree with. But there must be something dragging him in that direction, whether it is online actors trying to profit off of division, whether it's the algorithm we talked about, whether it's extremist groups who want to thrive and want to see us all shooting each other one day so they can get power. I don't know. But that person, who probably was a reasonable individual possibly a few years ago, in such a short period of time due to the rhetoric we've seen online recently, had devolved into somebody who's somebody they don't even know, in a community that isn't theirs. They had a southern accent, they're not from Maryland, or they're from Cecil County, and coming to me and telling me I deserve death because I wore a hoodie. It was ridiculous. But the other instance of violence I saw, and it was so silly. I saw there was a press pool near the Capitol, and there was journalists recording, the January 6th protesters like scuffling with police, and one of them turns and says, "Behind me is a riot." And one of the protesters hear that, and they walk up to the press pool, and you're like, "You motherfucker, how dare you?" And he takes an American flag and he starts waving it in front of the camera, trying to basically stop them from getting a picture. And then other people gather. And then they start throwing bottles. Then they start throwing other items. Then they grabbed the metal barrier that divided them from the press pool, pushed it back and forth, tore it down, took all their camera equipment, and smashed it. Smashed it. And the reason they destroyed their camera equipment and forced those journalists away was because they were called rioters. The irony in that cannot be understated.
I was actually at that exact moment as well. It's cool to see that our paths kind of crossed. So I would just point out that January 6th was so enormous that like any individual person who you ask, like their experience was different. So like my friend John, who's in the audience right here, we met up the night before, and then throughout January 6th, we got completely different stuff and never crossed paths the entire day, despite both filming sort of immense violence. Out of the people in this room, show of hands, how many of you are aware that January 6th was the third of 3 large-scale marches in Washington, D.C. for Trump between the election and the inauguration? Did anyone know that? So what's one person raised their hand out of maybe 20 people in this room. So something that I think, I could talk a lot about January 6th, the day itself, but I think that part of the real serious problem is that the media has been so focused on sort of violence when it happens that they are completely oblivious to violence when it's on the way. For me, the fact that something would happen January 6th, and I wasn't exactly sure how it would look, but the fact that that was going to be an insane day in American history was incredibly obvious well before the day of January 6th. So there had been 2 million MAGA marches, November 14th and December 12th in DC leading up to it. And both of those had also hundreds of thousands of Trump supporters on the street and individual groups that were engaged in street fights basically with both actual leftists and people who they perceived as leftists, in some cases wrongly. But so there were several stabbings in the couple months before related to this exact issue. There was the stealing of a Black Lives Matter banner from a church, which was set on fire on December 12th by the Proud Boys. And throughout the country, there were Stop the Steal events in individual states. I think that these images are not burned in America's head in the same way. But for example, on December 12th, on the same day that the Supreme Court rejected the case where Texas was trying to sue Pennsylvania over their election rules, in Georgia, there were anti-fascists, Antifa, with long guns, shotguns, pistols, in full black bloc and facing down with 3 percenters, militia clad folks wearing camo and stuff in the streets of Atlanta, right? Dozens of each side of that. And that didn't turn hot, so to speak. They didn't end up shooting each other. But you had armed folks on both sides with a diverging reality, at least hypothetically prepared to kill each other on the streets of an American city over this subject. So I could talk a lot about January 6th itself, but I guess what I would just say is the failure of the media is that whole movement, right, there's so much that led up to it, and yet on the day of, they all kind of got surprised and they all tried to figure out how are we going to cover this as it was taking place, but it took everybody else by surprise as if it was sort of a spontaneous event. And I think that that's a failure of the media actually not talking to people, right? They talk to political correspondents and, you know, commentators. They have their little panels on CNN and whatever. But by failing to actually talk to people on the street, they are not understanding what's sort of coming up. And I think that we're in a state of the exact same ignorance now, that this sort of violence is probably going to re-erupt in the next couple of years, and the media is completely oblivious to it.
Ford, I want to ask you, because I've admired your work with News to Share, where you've been an independent journalist, going to places where journalists don't go, right?
In some cases.
And covering protests. And so I really admire that you started a business out of just doing something that was kind of a cool hobby, and it became your livelihood. So I really admire you for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But what I want to ask you, since you've put yourself in dangerous positions before, where is an example from your career where you've seen political violence and it's impacted you while you've been reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that would be basically January 6th as the most poignant example. I think the other one would, of course, be Charlottesville. So Charlottesville kind of had the same pattern that I just described, where I think that to most of the country, the images of torch-bearing white nationalists chanting "Jews will not replace us" at the University of Virginia at Charlottesville was surprising and perhaps felt like it was coming out of nowhere. But I had been documenting the movement that led up to that, and it was sort of obvious to me that something would happen at Charlottesville. Not necessarily car attack and a police helicopter crashing and that's how 3 people die, right? The specifics of the kind of violence that happened, right? No one could have predicted exactly how 4 people would die at the Capitol and then some people sort of subsequently. But the fact that there would be enormous violence at Charlottesville was something that journalists were sounding the alarm on, that activists were sounding the alarm on. It was incredibly obvious to anybody paying attention to these movements. And again, the media didn't sort of get there and start to address it until it went hot, until it went basically crazy. But now that moment has been looked back on as the summer of hate. And it's because it kind of led up to Charlottesville as the climax of a building tension that had already been taking place.
So Ford's got this cool POV from being like in the heart of protests and everything. And Dylan has this experience of being on the front lines with the war in Ukraine. So Dylan, I would like to hear a little bit, if you could kind of compare, contrast, or what was similar, what was different in Ukraine and the United States with political violence and extremism from what you saw being in Ukraine and also documenting politics here in the United States.
The scariest thing about it is the rhetoric is very similar. I interviewed a Euromaidan protester in the city of Kharkiv 8 years after the fact while the city was being bombed. We had an actual electrical outage because the Russians targeted the electrical grid while I was interviewing her. And she told me about her experience participating in Euromaidan. And for those of you who don't know what Euromaidan is, there's a lot of conflicting opinions about it, but I'll express mine. There was a government in Ukraine led by Yanukovych who tried to destroy an agreement that the majority of Ukrainians supported with the European Union. That was an economic agreement. He pulled back upon it. Then there were protests in response to it. Then there was violence in response to those protests by security forces, paid thugs. The mafia is very deep in Ukraine, in places like Odessa and other areas. And then eventually Yanukovych made moves to try to ban protesting. Basically, well, he was not, I'm going to ban protesting. It's no more than 3 people can be gathered, which is banning protesting. And the Euromaidan eventually scared him enough, because it got built up enough movement, to make him flee the country. And then they had a democratic election in 2014 where Petro Poroshenko was elected, and that's when Russia invaded Crimea because Yanukovych was their ally, and they didn't like how he fled the country after brutalizing the population. Well, I interviewed her about participating in Euromaidan, and she talked about the rhetoric she would hear from people and how it was impossible for her own family members across the border in Russia to believe the violence that she would see. She would talk to them about, my friend, he got stabbed by one of these paid thugs, one of these paid pro-Russian thugs. And he'd be like, no, he must have done something wrong. He must have done something wrong. You must not be giving me the full picture, but I saw it. And that rhetoric kept escalating in that dialogue with family members until this war, when my friend Anna, her father was killed in a Russian artillery strike. He was outside on his front porch. He was a gardener, feeding a cat and gardening. The artillery hits him, tears him to shreds. It's a very gruesome picture. There's still blood on the side of the building, even a month later, from how much he was incinerated. His intestines, it was very bad. And that was her father, the person who raised her. And so her mom, who gave me this thing I'm wearing right now to protect me when I was on the front line, talking to one of her family members across the border in Russia about what happened. And they asked her, well, was his house a military base? Well, he must have done something. It was impossible for the family members they had in Russia, due to the rhetoric they had heard on state TV and the rhetoric they had seen on state media, to even imagine that somebody on the other side of the war could have been brutalized in that way. And I've seen the same thing when I go to protests and I describe violence that I saw when I'm talking to some conservative members of my family. Like, oh no, Dylan, when you were maced, you must have done something. You must have done something when you were maced. Or Dylan, when that thing that got that stabbing, like obviously there must have been some provocative thing that happened. It's the comfort of that alternative reality that your side can do no wrong, that both the left and the right enjoys from social media bubbles and their social circles. And I think that's something that needs to be smashed, because that rhetoric, obviously, there's many causes to the war in Ukraine, but that rhetoric can have deadly consequences.
So last question, we'll see if we can get some audience Q&A in. News headlines, when you Google extremism in the United States, say it is on the rise in America. So what do you think? Is political extremism on the rise, or is this the news being the news? What do you think, Dylan and Ford?
I think it's very hyperbolic, but it also depends on what you mean by extremism. If you look at like the 60s and 70s in this country, some people forget about Weather Underground. Some people forget about the bombings of government buildings and the type of, I'm saying this at a libertarian convention, but the anti-government extremism that sometimes would happen, and other attacks that would happen. People remember Waco. And so I think a lot of people, who have been born in the last 20 years, like myself, I was born in 2001, it's hard for us to imagine that it could have ever been any worse than it is now. But in American history, there's been a lot of periods of extremism. During the civil rights movement, I think a lot of people have this image about Martin Luther King and like this peaceful civil rights movement, but Martin Luther King was beaten. So was John Lewis, so was many other civil rights activists, not only by counter-protesters, but also by police and by political extremists at the time. You got people like Malcolm X, who there's pictures of him with guns looking out the window talking about needing to be armed, and Ronald Reagan responded to that by some of the first gun control legislation California ever saw was started by Ronald Reagan, a loved Republican president. And so I think we try to imagine, it's almost like main character syndrome, I call it, that this is the most extreme, violent period in American history since the Civil War. And I hate it when people use that word so flippantly, Civil War, because I've been to war zones, and you should use that war very, very carefully, because you do never want to be in a position where your neighbor is shooting you and you're shooting your loved ones, because that's what it always boils down to. That's what it boiled down to in Yugoslavia, and that's what it's boiling down to right now in Ukraine. And so I think it's bad, it's escalated, but I do think that people need to keep this in a historical perspective, that this is one small blip in American history, and it's bad right now, but be careful the type of language you use to describe it.
Ford, and then we'll do one fast, quick question, burning question from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I quickly will just say, I've heard some objections in kind of the academic world that studies this subject to the term extremism to describe this. So, January 6th, someone could define as, oh, this was a conglomeration of different extremists who came together and stormed the Capitol. The fundamental guiding belief that caused them all to do that was that they believed that the election was stolen. If you fundamentally thought that American democracy was crumbling, you might do something pretty extreme as well. Again, right now, the second largest party is the Republican Party in the United States, and about 3/4 of Republicans currently believe that. So I have a hesitation to actually use the label of extremist to describe any particular ideology. I would say that rather than extremism is on the rise, the sort of binary that the media and politicians have created for us of left and right, their realities are more divergent. There is a more extreme divergence of reality in this country. And so while I hesitate to label individual people, you're an extremist, you're all extreme, whatever, I would just say there's a more extreme division of reality, and I think that probably comes to another breaking point in the next couple of years.
One burning audience question. Please, Dick.
Darren Pollack from LP Texas. Darren Pollack from LP Texas, and I just wanted to ask both of you, since you've been to a lot of protests in the U.S., do you see any involvement that you've noticed from agent provocateurs at all, maybe from the federal side or anything like that? I mean, you guys have seen a lot of them. I'm just curious if you think that's been the case.
I have one story, and I can't believe I have that one story. He was talking about the Million MAGA March earlier,
Yeah.
and I went to the Million MAGA March as well. I was there when people were stabbed. It was pretty bad. That was when I got maced by a Proud Boy. The Proud Boys, and I know there are some people who are sympathetic to them. I see them as just a fight club. They're a bunch of hooligans who go around and look for fights. And that day, I saw a lot of, let's say, slow actions from police to do something to stop violence. They eventually stepped in, but I was very disappointed as somebody who's a DMV local about the police response. And later, there was a story that broke that one of the people, I believe it was a police captain, was actually communicating the location of counter-protesters to the Proud Boys, telling them where they were in advance. Oh, they're at this part of the city. Oh, they're at this part of the city. Was he a provocateur? I don't know. But that type of communication between individual police officers and what I would call a fight club, extremist group, whatever you want to call it, is dangerous, and it upset me because that was the person who was hired and paid to protect people who live in the community like me. And so it was very strange to see them directly help the people who really weren't from DC, weren't from the DMV. A lot of them were from states around Maryland, but they weren't from the community. And so that was the one instance I could say. But on January 6th, I didn't see any clear FBI agents coordinating anything like that. There have been a few conspiracy theories about me doing things on January 6th because I was wearing the Biden hoodie. But that's the only instance I can think that even somewhat relates to what you asked.
I think that there's a tendency of people sometimes to try to find a solution that kind of fits their worldview. So if you're someone who is on the MAGA side, you've probably never experienced before January 6th the narrative that says MAGA fighting police, right? That is not something that traditionally defined the Trump era. It basically just didn't happen very much. Usually the police and the MAGA were kind of aligned, and very often it was counter-protesters versus police as kind of the violence that occurred. And so there was a sort of tendency toward rationalization that happened right after, where there was a idea of either it must have been the Antifa did something, they must have put on MAGA hats and done what we said we were going to do for a few months, or that it was federal instigators or something like that. For January 6th itself, there is precisely one example I'm aware of a person who was not a Trump supporter who put on a MAGA hat. That was a YouTuber named Jaden X who intentionally put on a MAGA cap and was saying things like, we're going to burn this B word for YouTube down, and things like that. He was actually provoking it, while he has said since then and before then that he is not a Trump supporter. Every other example that I have seen where people point out this person is a federal instigator or this person must be an Antifa or whatever, that it's never been backed by kind of actual evidence in my mind. And so I think that the role of provocateurs in making events happen altogether is fairly limited. I will say September 18th, there was a rally called Justice for J6. It was people who were of the opinion that January 6th defendants are being over-prosecuted, and it took place at the Capitol, and police were very, very kind of heavily armed in anticipation of this because it was being referred to as sort of a possible secondary attack. It was a very exaggerated fear of what might happen, and the day didn't end up having any violence. However, there was one person who was wearing a black mask and sunglasses, and police noticed that this individual was carrying a firearm, which you are definitely not allowed to do at the Capitol, dressed as such. And so a team surrounded him with shields, big cops with kind of gear all kind of go around him, and they're like, "Where's the gun?" And he shows his badge. And And so I actually did manage to capture on camera what ended up being, it turned out he actually was literally a federal agent who was spotted with a firearm and was basically outed. He was escorted away from the event, surrounded by police. They later said, we arrested one individual with a firearm, and then later they confirmed that individual did work for, it actually ended up being something weird. It was like ICE from New Jersey or something. Like, it wasn't that he was an FBI agent. They said that he was a federal agent at a different agency who just happened to show up wearing a mask and carrying a gun. And then they said, we are not charging him, and they had no explanation of why he was not being charged. Federal agents are probably surveilling and at these things. I think that makes sense as a law enforcement prerogative. You would imagine that they're going to infiltrate events for surveillance and so forth. I think that to the extent that people are concerned about are feds making the thing happen, that probably doesn't happen as often as the internet would have you believe.
Great question, and please round of applause for Dylan Burns and Ford Fischer.